climate change is heading in a bad place. What we're seeing is increasing CO2 concentrations, increasing temperatures, changing rainfall patterns. So that means that all of the parameters, if you like, in the world we live in are changing too, because the climate is changing. So why is that going to be a problem, and what's the biggest problem? So the answer to that is that the biggest problem is that there are lots of problems, and all of those problems interact to make a bigger problem. So that's a sort of that's a really complicated thing to think about, isn't it? It's called feedbacks and interactions. So they're again fancy words. What do I mean? Let's think about, a big problem being caused by lots of little problems. Well, let's think about bushfires, for instance. So you have hotter summers, you have drier winters. So you have hotter summers and drier winters, but you've got also more CO2. So in the atmosphere, because they're driving those hotter summers and drier winters. So plants are trying to grow, and yes, it's true, they like CO2, but they also need water. So they're getting stressed because their diet, if you like, their atmospheric diet is getting all mixed up. And they're very sensitive. Each plant on Earth is tuned to a particular diet of water and gas, believe it or not. So if you stress them, they're struggling to grow because they're not getting the water when they need it. There might be a lot of carbon dioxide, but that's not actually helping them necessarily, because they might not be getting the water they need. That the water is coming, in different ways. Maybe it's very intense and the soils aren't being wet. So then you've got these changed rainfall patterns and stressed plants, and then you have very hot summers. And the very hot summers mean that you're going to have bushfires. And before you know it, you've got stressed forests that are being burnt by intense bushfires because of heat waves. And then all of the seedlings that are coming up, that are adapted to come up after a bushfire, they're suddenly struggling too, because the climate change is affecting their ability to grow. Maybe, for instance, that there's all of these seedlings and then the autumn is really dry. And so all of these little seedlings that are expecting it to be a wet autumn are suddenly drought stressed, and the little seedlings can barely cope with that drought stress. And then you want to know what happens? Suddenly there's a big rainstorm, and all of the soil that these poor little seedlings are living in is suddenly washed away into the river, which is now flooding. And the seed banks are also being washed down the river. So suddenly you've got these poor little seedlings who are now on, hillsides that are being denuded by floods. And then they're going into a winter, and the winters are drier. And when you have drier winters and you've got no canopy, suddenly there are frosts. And so the poor little seedlings that made it through the flood and, are trying to recover, to rebuild the forest, are suddenly being frozen to death by these very, very cold winter temperatures. And then the spring comes around, and the few that have made it are struggling to grow, and they are growing slower. And because they're growing slower and they're being really harshly treated by all of these climate vicissitudes, all of these changes, they grow slower, they're shorter, and they take longer to mature. And because they take longer to mature, they exposed. The entire regrowing forest is exposed, because if it gets reburnt, then there are no seeds. And then you could say, you could go from having a very healthy, tall, productive forest to a bare wasteland, which just crashed because of all of these, what are called compounding events. Now, do you want to know something? That model that I've just told you, I've observed. We worked in Victoria, in the mountains of Victoria, and there was a forest which needed fire to regenerate. It got burnt, and it regenerated. Everything that it was meant to do happened. Then it got burnt again, and lots of the seedlings were killed. Then there were these terrible floods and erosion that washed away the seedlings. And then, do you want to know something? Because of climate change, all of these fires were being lit by lightning, that there was a third fire. And by this stage, the entire forest, the valley, which was only 10 years before a giant tall forest, was now just a wasteland. And do you know what happened? It was in a national park. And the national parks people go, well, maybe we're going to have to actually help this forest. So they talked to the foresters, and it turned out they had a seed bank. And they said, okay, let's get the seed bank, and we're going to get a helicopter, and we're going to spread the seed from the seed bank into the national park at a lower rate than you would use, because there wasn't an infinite supply of seed. And we're going to spread it in the valley so we can give this forest a chance to regenerate. And if the humans hadn't intervened, then that forest would have turned into basically a treeless wasteland. So that story is showing the sorts of complexities about compounding events, but it's also showing a really important thing, and that is that as the complexities, these compounding events, these interactions and feedbacks of climate change kick in, humans are smart and they can see these patterns and they can intervene and they can help nature along. So there's going to be a lot more what's called restoration. There's going to be restoration ecology, where we're going to intervene to say, hey, we don't want this forest to burn up, or we don't want this peatland to burn up, or this swamp to burn up. So we may actually go, you know, we really love these pencil pines and we want these pencil pines to grow. And it just so happens that there's a hydro pipe nearby. So how about we tap into the hydro pipe and put in sprays, and we're going to irrigate this little patch and to keep it safe, because they've been growing for thousands of years. They've been expecting a cool, wet climate. The climate's changing. So either we just let them die and get burnt, or we intervene and we irrigate them. And I actually think those interventions are really a positive thing. They're not a failure. They're actually allowing humans to become custodians, real custodians, and to imprint their lives and their stories. So how cool will that be, to be able to take, parents to be able to take children to a place and tell them the story of how they intervened because of the rapid climate change, and they saved this part of nature, and they did these things that made the world that, the future people are going to be in. And those future people, of course, are going to be really happy, because the climate change problem will have been solved because we will have decarbonised. And so there's this really important role now for your generation to be involved in stabilising the climate and saving parts of nature. But the nature won't be ungrateful. It means that your story and your life will be deeply entangled, deeply part of that. These are going to be really special places. And you want to know something? What we're really doing is we're really becoming like Indigenous people again, where our lives and our stories and our families are all wrapped up in the way we care for country. As in the Aboriginal English, we've used the word caring for country. And so this is a big project of, stabilising the climate, which we'll do, but then also caring for country to make certain the things that are vulnerable right now to climate change can keep going on into the future. And the humans will be really part of that story. So I think it's a really happy and positive thing, even though it's at first sight very scary.